the Welcome to Politics and Debate.
There were people in the Labor Party in the UK who could get up in Parliament and say they didn't agree with that policy, and that was not the end of their political careers. And even under John Howard, there were people who crossed the floor on this issue. And what I think we're seeing now is kind of a much higher level of party discipline on this issue, particularly in the Labor Party, because it has been so fraught. And I think one of the reasons why the asylum seeker issue has been politicised so greatly is precisely because it hits Labor where it hurts. It's a great wedge issue for the left.
I'm really asking you, what must it do? You know, because it can't defy the High Court decision.
The Labor Party must recognise that this is now the law in Australia, and it's not just legislation, it's actually constitutional limits. So this time they can't bypass it through legislation. And I think they should recognise that the High Court has a constitutional role and its decisions are legitimate for the reasons that are given, and support the High Court in that decision. And I'd be worried, I suppose, if we started to see the kind of attacking of the High Court that we did in the past. So I would say respect the law, respect the fact that the High Court has pronounced on that law, respect that there are now real limits on detention, and start thinking about ways of implementing this.
Cathy Bowden, Politics and the Pub team. Julian Burnside, QC, recently made a statement that Australians can look forward to seeing Tony Abbott and Scott Morrison in the dock in The Hague. Could you explain how that might eventuate?
Yeah, good question. Good question.
International criminal law, can I just say, is not my topic. I'd have to say, though, I suspect the realities of that happening are fairly limited, because ultimately someone has to refer them to the International Criminal Court. And the International Criminal Court has particular priorities in terms of what it's going to take on and what it doesn't take on. And my memory of international criminal law is vague, but I would be surprised if that is something that they were willing to take on. I do think, again, you know, we can't always rely on international people to do it. Ultimately, I think this is a question for the Australian community to resolve for itself, and we should, rather than looking forward to the day that Tony Abbott is in the dock, we should be working for change now.
Do you believe that we'll ever be able to get action outside of the Refugee Convention on, for instance, CROC, Convention on the Rights of the Child? In the last few days, my wife and I have heard terribly emotional detail from a former employee on Nauru who only left there 2 weeks ago, of the damage being done to the children on Nauru. They have no clothing, they have no proper footwear. One little boy is the subject of derision, a 7-year-old. He has one pair of shorts to wear which have holes in them, and he's forced to walk around with his genitals hanging out of them, and he's the subject of derision by the other detainees, etc. A mother tried to get a hairbrush for her 2 daughters, and the transfield supervisors told her that she should cut their hair like boys, and then she wouldn't have to worry about brushing her hair. And this is a company which we're paying millions of taxpayer dollars to run these facilities. What are the chances of bringing action under the Convention on the Rights of the Child for these sorts of abuses? The other question that I would like to put is, how does Al-Qatar fit with today's decision of the High Court, the 2004 decision where the High Court found that there could be indefinite detention for stateless persons?
Some other questions would be good. Okay, so the first question on the Convention on the Rights of the Child. There is, in fact, I believe, a litigation at the moment in relation to, there is actually domestic law in some ways that could apply. So the Australian government arguably still has a duty of care towards those children, and could be sued for any neglect that occurs during the detention of the children. So that's much more likely to be effective than under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which doesn't actually have, I mean, most of the obligations are principles in nature which are difficult to enforce as such. Having said that, I think if we are going to see action anywhere, it will be actually with children, because I think that is the thing that touches the deepest chord with the Australian public. And that is certainly the chord that the refugee advocates have been striking very effectively, I think. And it is terrible, absolutely, what's happening to these children. But I actually think if there is a prospect for advocacy in this area, it's around children in detention. So the second question, architect. Oh, yes. It's very interesting because it's not mentioned at all really in the High Court case, and effectively all the cases in between Chuki and Lim, which was the case in 1992 and since then, are not really referred to. I would say they have implicitly decided that that was possibly wrong. They haven't come out and said it because it wasn't actually litigated in that case. But I think it would be very difficult to see how those two sit together. So I think it's in some ways an invitation to challenge Al-Khatib directly. I don't really see that those two can be reconciled very effectively.
You mentioned that Operation Sovereign Borders may be illegal, and I wonder, is the implication of the next case to come through? Is there going to be a case by lawyers representing refugees to actually challenge Operation Sovereign Borders head-on? That would be a fantastic case which we in the pro-refugee community could try to mobilise around, to actually take sovereign borders head-on and have it ruled illegal.
It's a good question, and probably one that we'd have to decide after we hear what the High Court has to say about this case. With this case actually does raise the question of the legality of Operation Sovereign Borders in some ways. So the High Court could make statements that make it clear one way or the other if it decided to do so. I would say the practical difficulty of challenging Operation Sovereign Borders head-on is that first we have to have the clients who've been intercepted and turned back, and obviously that's a real practical challenge once they're outside Australia especially. So I think actually this case is probably one of the best cases, partly because it's so extreme to challenge Operation Sovereign Borders and what it's doing. And it might well be that the High Court decides that there are limits and expresses them, as it did in today's case, which didn't have to go into detention in such a way that it effectively would make Operation Sovereign Borders illegal. So wait and see at this point, I think.
Given the horrific evidence that we all heard from the Human Rights Inquiry into Children in Immigration Detention, I'm just wondering that it's a psychiatric emergency on Christmas Island and obviously on Nauru. The Human Rights Commission wasn't allowed to go to Nauru to do assessments, but we're hearing through other means. What chances are there, do you believe, that we could ever get an independent guardian for the children, maybe following the release of the Human Rights Commission inquiry in September, I think it's due? We need it desperately, and we have for years and years and years. I just wonder what on earth can be done to push that as hard as we possibly can, because many of these children will never recover. And many of us that have been involved for years know children that are still needing so much psychiatric help. So I'd just like your opinion from both of you. Thank you. And thank you for your wonderful, wonderful talks.
That's a very good point. And I think that the issue of the conflict of interest that the Minister has as both the Minister and the Guardian was raised at least 10 years ago. I'm not quite sure the technicalities of how an independent guardian would be set up, so I'll leave that to our expert lawyer. But I still think that at the root of many of the issues that we're facing in Australia, there's a cultural, political issue that we have to face. And I think that we need to really examine our own values and ethics and ask, is this something that we want to do? Otherwise we keep seeing new permutations of deterrence and problem, and I would like to see a bit of a shift in the debate so that we can quite fundamentally change our thinking around irregular migration and around people coming. Interestingly, a few years ago, the IPA put out a paper, and it's rare that I have any sympathy whatsoever with an IPA paper. And I can't remember who wrote it, but they argued that in actual fact, people who come by boat are probably the best prospective citizens that we can have, because they've shown a resourcefulness and level of enterprise that would be very good for the nation.
You have to give me that reference.
And while I might agree with the end point, I would like our acceptance of refugees coming by boat to be based on a slightly different value framework. So I guess it comes back to, I think, civil society forums and really trying to have a good long hard look at ourselves and ask ourselves, who are we, what do we believe, what do we value, and what are the limits of those values. And I think we've got a really deep hypocrisy with having signed the convention, chairing the UN Security Council. We're now bidding for a seat on the Human Rights Committee, and at the same time we're doing this. So we're wanting to look like a good international citizen while we're not actually standing up to our obligations and promises that we've made over the last 50 or 60 years.
Okay, so the Cultural Centre did actually make a submission to the Human Rights Commission on exactly that topic of the guardianship of unaccompanied minors. Pleased to hear. Unfortunately, my expert on the team, Jenny Whelan, who's a member of the centre, isn't here, and she's really the expert on this area. But my assessment is that there is actually real momentum in this space on the guardianship. I know that UNICEF held a roundtable on that exact topic. The question is exactly, when refugee advocates and people interested in space clearly agree that the conflict of interest is a real problem and needs to be fixed, and there needs to be an independent guardian. The next question that we were trying to get to in that submission was really about how this would work and what was the best mechanism for doing so. The Greens currently have a bill on an independent guardian of unaccompanied minors up before the Senate, which is being examined by the Senate Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee soon. That proposes an entirely independent statutory guardianship model, but there are other ways of doing it. An interesting point was we looked in that submission as to what was happening elsewhere in this space, and there's been quite a lot of work done in Europe, for example, in this area. And there is a pilot being run by the UK government, not specifically on asylum seekers, but on trafficked children and the appointment of guardians there, and there was quite a lot of debate in that space. So I actually think that there is perhaps room for movement, and I think the advocacy of the Australian Churches Refugees Task Force has been fantastic in this space and really highlighting that. So I'm hopeful that this is a reform that might happen, but I think it is one we will need to argue for. But of all, again, as I say, of all the things that we might be able to reform, this is possibly one that we see, I suppose, greater room for movement than in other areas such as offshore processing, which are much more controversial.
Joyce, as a former Malaysian myself, I do agree wholeheartedly with what you said. In that sometimes Australia thinks that they are the big boy in Asia trying to tell people what to do, and so that amounts to that sort of present type of behavior towards refugees. You can see the recent turn down by the High Court of the Malaysian solution under the Gillard government. If we have a Bill of Rights, could that safeguard the integrity of what we are seeing today, that the fascist Morrison would not behave in the way he has? The arrogance of not telling the press to the elected people, hiding away those Sri Lankan people. And I'm also interested about the Cambodian issue, about giving them a few quid so they can take this poor migrants, as what they are doing in Nauru.
Okay, so I'll take the Cambodian proposal first, and I've been on the public record a bit about this. I do think that this is an especially worrying proposal by the Australian government, because it does effectively shifts the idea of burden sharing. So suddenly we're expecting very poor countries to share the so-called burden. And this Cambodia is an especially poor country, and anyone who's been there is shocked at the idea of putting people there. The other main concern, obviously, is that these people are mostly coming from the Middle East. Cambodia is not a multicultural country. It has no support services to support these people to help them integrate. These are people who are from a very alien culture. They don't speak the local language. It's difficult to see how these people are intended to integrate into society and have what ultimately refugee law wants them to have, which is durable solutions. A real life. You know, a life where you can wake up and think of your children's future. I mean, that's really what it's about. And Cambodia in no way will meet those rights. But I think the other concern I have about the Cambodian solution is that as a former Malaysian, I know that it's not productive to start sort of shooting the Cambodian government. The Cambodian government has a lot of problems, the Cambodian country has a lot of problems, but ultimately the responsibility for this solution is ours, and that's the key point to keep in mind, that these are effectively our refugees whom we owe legal obligations to, not Cambodia. And so we shouldn't run down Cambodia, I think, in this process, because they are effectively looking after their own interest, which is absolutely understandable. But I think the implications for this are startling, because effectively we're saying we can sort of subcontract out our obligations under the Refugees Convention to whichever poor, unlucky country we can manage to foist them off on. So I think there's real problems there, and I've forgotten your other question now.
The Bill of Rights.
Bill of Rights.
On Scott Morrison.
Yeah, well, I don't think it would stop Scott Morrison from doing everything he's doing, but it does. A Bill of Rights provides a real framework for protection. Having looked at the UK system and seeing the difference between how their legal system responds and our legal system responds to the same challenges, there's a world of difference. And partly it's just about the questions that we ask under the human rights frameworks. The human rights framework looks at the refugee and looks at the power relationship between the state, Australia, and the refugee. Currently, because we lack that framework, almost all our legal discussion is really about the power between different organs of government. And we lose many of the relevant questions. We lose the questions about, are we treating these people humanely? We lose the questions about, are we protecting this person? And so I think it would be a dramatic difference if we did have a Bill of Rights, and certainly the policies we've adopted now would not pass the scrutiny of a human rights law framework. I do think that's one of the reasons we didn't manage to get the Human Rights Act up the last time. It's because of this particular issue and the concerns felt across parties that this would constrain them. And certainly if you look at what is happening in the UK now, the lack of support for the Human Rights Act is in part because they feel that it's been giving rights to non-British people. But that is exactly the purpose of human rights, is to protect people who can't be protected under our democratic process because they aren't part of the community and they can't vote. So I think the argument, sadly, in the public for the Human Rights Act has faded, but I think it should be an important part of the discussion if we are going to improve refugee protection in Australia.
Lucy, you mentioned that a lot of other governments are watching what Australia is doing. And is there actual evidence of, maybe UK or any of the European immigration policies are being fashioned along Australian lines, or?
Unfortunately, yes. The International Detention Coalition recently released a paper in which they've traced the ways in which the USA, the UK, other EU nations and Australia are learning from each other and progressively pushing the borders further out and working out what they can get away with and what they can't, and trying to do it incrementally. So yes, and I know that some years ago the Irish government sent a study group here. A couple of years ago I was on a plane coming back from Christmas Island, and I sat next to a delegate from the Canadian government who had been here visiting the Christmas Island Detention Centre. thankfully he said that he thought there wouldn't be an appetite for this in Canada. But yes, absolutely, the different governments are looking to each other, and Australia is at the front of the pack.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with that. When I was living in the UK, Australian refugee policy was very much discussed, and they actually adopted an immigration policy while I was there, which they trumpeted as an Australian-style immigration policy. That was really around, not the refugee space, but around, I should clarify, the points skills system. But at the time, one of the most influential think tanks at the time was run by an Australian. So there's a huge amount of traffic in the policy ideas in the space, and we do live in a globalised world, and what we do is very much out there, and we get calls all the time from international journalists who are interested in this space. So absolutely, what we do does matter, and it is obvious to people outside. The only other point I would say to that is that a lot of these countries have human rights protections that would limit their ability to do what we're doing. So Canada, for example, couldn't get away with that kind of mandatory detention, neither could the UK. And I think also their democracies are probably more robust in some ways in fighting these things than we are. So even though they're watching, I think the things we're doing now are things that would not be possible in a lot of liberal democratic countries which do have an embedded human rights framework, and that is something that I think is sorely missing in Australia. Nowhere else is more evident than in this space.
At the moment, both parties are putting out that they have to put refugees on offshore islands because they're saving them drowning at sea. Now, this is quite the most ridiculous thing that they could say, because there are other policies that could be followed. They could be processing people in regional places. And do you think that there's any hope at all of possibly getting Indonesia to look at processing there, or Malaysia, or one of the other regions? Because we would very much like to dispel the fact that we have to put people on offshore islands to stop them dying at sea, but this seems to be being swallowed by a lot of the population. And I think because Scott Morrison has a megaphone type of political agenda, he can get that message out, and it's much harder for anybody else to counter that, because nobody seems to be countering it in public at the moment. So I'd be interested to hear what both you have to say about that.
Sorry, there was quite a lot in your question. Indonesia is not very keen on processing in Indonesia. They've got a lot of other issues on their plate that they're trying to deal with, and refugees really are a bit of a mosquito to them in terms of importance. But they're not wanting to become a processing country because they're very aware of the numbers that Malaysia and Thailand have, and they don't want to increase the numbers that they have. It's a very small archipelago with, I think, 250 plus million people. Having said that, nor are they particularly interested in cracking down on refugees. So the refugee issue doesn't rate very highly either one way or another in Indonesia. There's been a change of government there recently, and that may well lead to slightly different approaches and could be beneficial to refugees, but we have to wait and see. Thailand, I only know a little bit about, but things are very strained there at the moment. Martial law was only lifted about 10 days ago, and civil society is very muted there at the moment, and I think the government is not at all keen on accepting refugees. They do have processing there. In all three countries there is processing through the UNHCR, just not through the governance. Malaysia has been talking with the UNHCR about what they're calling the fourth durable solution, and they're looking at the possibility of regularising a lot of the refugees who are there through a labour migration program. But the sticking point there, which is no small sticking point, is that the UNHCR wants a guarantee of non-refoulement, non-return, whereas the Malaysian government wants to know that at the end of any labour migration scheme there is somewhere that they can send people on to. So that's not a small barrier to be overcome, but at least there are discussions. So we'll see.
So I think Lucy here is more of the expert on the region, but as someone who was born in Malaysia until, for 18 years was a Malaysian citizen, I think from an Asian perspective, we do look at this and say, okay, why is this suddenly our problem? Ultimately, Australia is a rich, affluent country which is uniquely well equipped to resettle refugees. Making it Asia's problem, I think, is not the answer. What we need to do is look to abide by our own obligations and accept people who arrive irregularly. Going back to the point about saving lives at sea, it is one that has been exercising minds for some time about how to counter that effectively. It's always very difficult to counter a simple message with complex answers, and that is part of the problem. But part of the difficulty, I think, that we have now is that we've created a situation where we have border enforcement to such an extent that it creates a market for people smugglers, but also creates incentives to arrive in unsafe boats. So one of the incentives that we have created is because we do also have obligations to preserve safety, like at sea. For example, we therefore will have to rescue distressed boats, which encourages sabotaging of boats. So in some ways that's a problem, but also because we have increased penalties on people smugglers to such an extent, they essentially have started using less safe boats, which are more disposable and cheaper, partly to offset some of these border enforcement. So there is some responsibility we should be taking in creating, I think, a market where safety is not as at a premium in bringing these people over. I think at the moment also it's hard to see, and I think advocates have been somewhat unwilling necessarily to talk about what Italy is doing, partly because we're not sure where that's going. But that takes a very different approach to saving lives at sea, and I think that's one that needs to be at least discussed, which is go out and save these people rather than deny them the opportunity to ever resettle here. So that is another way we could talk about this issue, but the difficulty with that is that it's not sure that this is a sustainable solution for Italy. Having said that, the numbers we receive are much fewer than those numbers. I mean, I think the latest I heard was 140,000 who've been arriving from North Africa to Europe, and the highest we ever had was really more in the tens of thousands in the same period. So I think it's not really a comparable flow. This sort of concern over saving lives at sea, I think, has translated into areas which can't be justified using that rhetoric. So last Friday I was in Parliament for a very little known bill, which you may have seen in the media, in relation to changing the threshold of the risk of torture. And this is a bill that has gained almost no attention apart from that initial hit, and that is actually by no means the worst provision of that bill. One of the most alarming provisions of this bill is that it will effectively require people to be denied protection visas if the minister suspects that they've provided fraudulent documents or destroyed or disposed of them, or has not reproduced them in response to a request. And that's actually a very significant proportion of people, and that's applying to people who've already applied for protection visas here. And my discussions indicate that that could apply to anything to 20 to 30% of the caseload of individual legal centres. And that's a very significant change, I think, to the system, but one that hasn't really been discussed at all. The bill is before the Senate Legal and Constitutional Committee at the moment, The point that I was making in relation to that bill was one of the senators was questioning us very closely and saying, okay, but this bill will save lives at sea. And in fact, the bill doesn't really affect irregular arrivals, mostly because they don't, as I said, actually have access to the protection visa system. It mostly affects people who have already arrived. And that moving of the justification, I mean, they seemed actually a little astonished when we said to them that there were people who arrived by plane, for example. They said, oh, well, you know, how else do people come here? Well, they come by plane as well, and that's actually who the bill will affect. But it started, that rhetoric has permeated the whole refugee space and is hard to justify.
Thank you, Lucy and Joyce. Very interesting discussion. Just in terms of Scott Morrison's comment, I think it was Tony Abbott who criticised the Refugee Convention itself, saying it was outmoded and outdated. What's your comment on that? And beyond that, given the fact that we've got probably the largest refugee crisis that we've had since post-World War II now, how does a global environment deal with this issue in a global way? Have you thought about that? Are there any capacity for us to deal with the millions of people who are being displaced because of the tensions that are happening at the moment?
I think there is an argument to be made that the Refugee Convention is outdated, but I think the basis on which I would argue that might differ slightly. You know, it doesn't. It is a historical document that was created in a particular time and place, and it doesn't include gender, for example, as a basis for making a claim. But I don't think that Scott Morrison is wanting to expand the protection offered by the convention. And so I think that refugee advocates or supporters are protective of not wanting to reopen any debate about the convention on fairly good grounds. But there is an issue globally with refugee signatory countries being increasingly reluctant to honour the obligations and looking at a range of political and legal ways in which they can constrict getting those obligations triggered, and Australia's policy of excision is goes exactly to that. It's to not trigger any legally enforceable rights that asylum seekers and refugees might have. And I think probably it needs to be a civil society engagement to try and reinvigorate it. I'm not really sure what will happen. I think it'll probably limp along a bit longer, but I would like to see the UNHCR globally take on more of an advocacy role, and it has some difficulties with that because it's funded almost entirely by states, which is directing its actions more into trying to prevent onward movement, and it's balancing some very difficult demands.
My issue is that we're all on about economic globalisation, movements global or the global village, and yet we're becoming much more nationalist in terms of some of these issues. And to me, that is such a dichotomy of approach and tension that it
I agree.
I just echo Lucy's comments about the outmodedness of the convention. I would agree that there are things that I would like in the convention, but I don't think they're the same as what Scott Morrison would like in the convention. And surprisingly, I think, I mean, it's hard to pinpoint exactly where he thinks it's outmoded as well. There have been refugee flows throughout history. In the essence, The only difference I can see is that we now have air transport, perhaps, and that has changed perhaps the pace of those movements and the length of those movements. But in the terms of the fundamental norms that the Refugee Convention applies, I would say those are far from outmoded. In fact, they are more needed now than ever. So I would disagree with him on that point. Can you say something? What's the other point? Oh, globalisation. I would just say that there are a number of initiatives looking at different forms of migration, and I think UNHCR talked about it as this Convention Plus idea. And yes, we should be looking at other ways of protection, but they should be in addition to the Refugee Convention.